Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling climate change. And this one's especially for our UPSC aspirants, those grappling with international relations and environmental issues.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. And to really get into it, we've got a bunch of sources tackling those big controversies surrounding climate change. Like what even causes it, how bad are the consequences,
Yeah.
and what can we actually do about it?
Yeah, these are definitely questions that anyone studying international relations needs to be ready to discuss,
Yeah,
especially for the UPSC exam.
for sure. Okay, so let's get started with the causes. One of our sources starts off with this great Mark Twain quote, "Climate is what we expect. Weather is what we get." Seems pretty simple, but it's really important for understanding climate change and those long-term patterns and trends.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I mean, we all see the weather change every day,
Yeah.
but climate change is about how those patterns change over decades and centuries.
Right, exactly. And, one of our sources talks about how the Earth's climate has always gone up and down, ice ages, warming periods, all that. It's all happened before.
Oh, yeah, definitely. About 55 million years ago, there was this time of really fast warming, even more intense than what we're seeing now. And that was totally natural. So it is important to understand those natural changes.
Okay, so the Earth's climate changes naturally,
Mhm.
but here's where it gets interesting. The sources point out that this warming trend that we're in right now, it's happening crazy fast.
Yeah.
And this time it seems like human activity is a big part of it.
Yeah, and to understand that, we have to talk about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They've done this massive job of going through tons of data to try and get some agreement from scientists. And their 2007 report was really clear. The Earth is getting hotter, and it's very likely because of what we humans are doing.
So no more arguing about whether it's happening. The IPCC shut that down.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But one source points out that there are still people who question the link between us and this warming trend. They point to things like natural climate variability or solar activity.
So how do we answer them? One of our sources explains this thing called the greenhouse effect, and it seems like a big part of the puzzle.
It is. The greenhouse effect is basically how certain gases in the Earth's atmosphere, like
Yeah.
carbon dioxide, trap heat from the sun. It's like, think of the atmosphere as blanket around the Earth.
Okay, get it.
The more of these gases we release, the thicker the blanket gets and the hotter the Earth gets.
Got it. So more gases equals warmer planet.
Exactly. And the IPCC has been watching this really closely. Their certainty about the link between these gases and warming has gone way up, from likely to very likely, meaning they're now over 90% sure.
Wow, 90%.
Yeah.
It's pretty convincing.
Yeah, it is. And this is where the science gets really mixed up with politics, because if we all agree that humans are the main reason for this warming, then we have to talk about who's responsible and how to fix it.
Okay, so the planet's heating up and it's probably our fault. Now let's look at how different schools of thought in international relations view climate change. Our sources start with realism.
Right. Realism is all about countries surviving and looking out for themselves in a world where there's no real global authority. They often see nature as a place to fight over resources.
Okay, so how does that work with climate change?
Well, think about it. As climate change makes resources more scarce, realists might say that countries will start fighting more over what's left.
Ah, so climate change could actually cause more geopolitical tension and even wars over resources.
Exactly. And we'll talk more about this later when we look at specific regions and resources.
Got it. So next, our sources look at the liberal perspective, which seems to see nature as something we use for our needs.
Yeah, in liberal thought, nature's value is tied to how useful it is for us. Ideas like property rights and making nature into something we buy and sell become really important.
So wouldn't that lead to conflict between economic growth, which needs natural resources, and trying to keep the environment healthy?
That's a big tension that liberals have to deal with, but it's important to remember that not all liberals think the same way. Some modern liberals talk about humans actually flourishing through being connected to nature.
So even within this one way of thinking, there are different ideas about how humans and the environment relate.
For sure. And we can't forget utilitarianism. This is a kind of liberal thinking that focuses on reducing suffering. And this idea could be used to think about how climate change might make other species and even future generations suffer.
So even within these big schools of thought, there are lots of different opinions about how to understand and deal with climate change.
Exactly. It's never just black and white. There's a lot of gray area.
Okay, now let's move on to some different perspectives that challenge those traditional views. Ecofeminism and green politics. One source highlights the ecofeminist view, which emphasizes the connection between women and nature, especially things like childbirth and nurturing.
Right. Ecofeminists often argue that the way we're hurting the environment is because of these patriarchal power structures that focus on dominating and controlling nature.
So they're saying there's a link between how we treat the environment and how we treat women.
Exactly. They contrast this with what they see as feminine values like reciprocity, cooperation, and caring for the environment, which could offer a different way to relate to nature.
That's a really interesting idea. It makes you think about who has power in our relationship with nature.
Definitely. And then there's green politics, which looks at nature as this interconnected web that includes both humans and non-humans.
And one of our sources mentions deep ecology, which seems like a more intense version of green politics.
Yeah, deep ecologists think that nature is valuable no matter how useful it is to humans. They want an ethical community where we don't have special rights over other species or the environment.
That's a huge change in thinking. It goes against the whole idea that humans are somehow superior.
It does. It asks us to rethink our place in the world and recognize that all living things are important.
Wow, this is a lot to take in.
Yeah.
We've explored the science behind climate change, gotten rid of some common misconceptions, and even looked at how different groups in international relations view this issue.
And this is just the beginning. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll connect these ideas to what's happening in the world, explore solutions, and talk about what it all means for our UPSC aspirants.
It's going to get really interesting. Make sure you come back for part 2, where we'll dive even deeper into the complexities of climate change and international relations. And if you're enjoying our deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. We'll be back soon with more insights.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Last time we looked at what causes climate change and how different schools of thought view this global challenge. Now let's focus on something that UPSC aspirants often find tricky: connecting these abstract ideas to real-world situations.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's one thing to understand the theory, but how do we actually apply it to things happening on the global stage?
Let's take the Arctic as an example. One source talks about how the Arctic ice is melting because of climate change, and this is opening up new routes for ships and chances to get resources.
That sounds like it could really change global trade and geopolitics.
Exactly. Now let's think about this like a realist would. As these new routes and resource areas open up, how do you think countries might react?
Well, if we're thinking like realists, we might see countries competing more, maybe even fighting to control these valuable resources and locations.
Exactly. We could see a new scramble for the Arctic, kind of like those old colonial fights over land and resources. This is just one example of how climate change can make existing tensions worse and create new ones.
So climate change is like adding fuel to the fire of global competition.
In a way, yes. But it's not all about conflict. Climate change can also lead to cooperation. Think about the potential for countries to work together on scientific research, developing new technology, and preparing for disasters.
So even realists might see the need for some cooperation to deal with this threat.
Absolutely. No country can completely escape the effects of climate change. Even if a country just wants to protect itself, it needs to work with others to deal with the risks and adapt to the changing environment.
That makes sense. Now let's look at this from a liberal perspective. How might they approach the melting Arctic ice?
Liberals, with their emphasis on institutions and cooperation, might see this as a chance to create rules for managing these new spaces and resources.
So instead of everyone rushing in, we might see international agreements or treaties that control access to the Arctic. Maybe even new international organizations focused on governing the Arctic.
Exactly. Liberals might want ways to make sure the benefits from resource extraction are shared fairly and to protect the Arctic environment. They might also focus on scientific collaboration and sharing information to better understand the effects of climate change in the region.
This shows how important it is to understand the different views within liberalism. Not all liberals would deal with this the same way.
Right. Some might prioritize economic opportunities while others might focus on protecting the environment. There could be debates about using market-based solutions versus regulations.
So understanding these complex issues means understanding not just the different schools of thought, but also the variations within them.
Exactly. And that's the kind of critical thinking that the UPSC exam looks for. It's not enough to just memorize facts. You have to be able to analyze different viewpoints, weigh the pros and cons, and form your own opinions.
Okay, so we've seen how climate change can change the global landscape, creating both challenges and opportunities. Now let's talk solutions. Our sources don't really go into detail about specific policies, but what can we learn from what we've discussed so far?
Well, we can start by thinking about how these different schools of thought might approach solutions.
So a realist focused on their country's interests might prioritize strategies that help their country adapt to climate change. Things like securing access to important resources, strengthening their military, or investing in infrastructure to protect people from climate-related disasters.
Exactly. They might also be skeptical of international agreements that they see as limiting their country's power or choices.
While a liberal might see international cooperation as the only way to solve a problem that affects the entire world, they might push for stronger global agreements like the Paris Agreement and advocate for mechanisms to help developing countries transition to cleaner economies.
Right. They might also emphasize market-based solutions, like putting a price on carbon or setting up emissions trading schemes to encourage businesses to reduce their environmental impact.
And then we have those critical perspectives like ecofeminism and green politics that might call for more fundamental changes to our economic and political systems.
Exactly. They might advocate for moving away from an economic model that's all about growth and towards one that prioritizes sustainability and well-being. They might also push for recognizing the rights of nature and future generations in decision-making.
It's clear that understanding these different perspectives is crucial for analyzing the problem and figuring out potential solutions. There's no one right answer.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for UPSC aspirants to not just know the basics of agreements like the Paris Agreement, but also to think critically about their strengths and weaknesses, the challenges of putting them into practice, and the ongoing debates about climate action.
This has been really informative, but I have one more question. Our sources mention geopolitics, but they don't fully explain how it connects to climate change. Can you talk more about that?
Sure, geopolitics is all about how geography affects power dynamics and international relations. It's about controlling space resources and strategic locations. And as we saw with the Arctic example, climate change can totally change the geopolitical landscape.
So how does this play out in other parts of the world?
We'll consider water scarcity. As climate change changes rainfall patterns and makes droughts worse, competition for water could become a big problem, especially in places where water is already scarce.
So we might see conflicts over rivers, lakes, and underground water sources, especially in regions where water resources are shared by multiple countries.
Exactly. And we could also see more migration and displacement as people have to leave areas that become uninhabitable because of drought, rising sea levels, or other climate impacts. This could put even more pressure on resources and contribute to social unrest.
It sounds like climate change is adding a whole new layer of complexity to an already unstable world.
It is.
And understanding these dynamics is crucial for anyone interested in international relations, whether you're a UPSC aspirant or just someone trying to understand what's happening in the world.
This has been a great discussion, and I'm really looking forward to talking about specific policies and solutions in the last part of our deep dive. But before we move on, I want to remind our listeners to stay tuned for part 3, where we'll get into those details. And if you're finding this deep dive valuable, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more discussions. We'll be back soon. Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've looked at the science behind climate change, the different perspectives on it, and how it's reshaping the world. Now in this final part, we're focusing on something super important for our UPSC aspirants, the international laws and policies around climate change.
Yeah, this is where it gets real. It's not enough to just get the problem. We need to know what's being done about it globally.
Exactly. Our sources didn't really go into specific policies, but one thing kept coming up: the Paris Agreement. That seems like a big deal in international climate action. Oh, it definitely is the Paris Agreement. It was adopted back in 2015, and it's a legally binding international treaty with almost 200 countries involved. It's a huge step towards a global response to climate change.
Okay, so what are the main points of the Paris Agreement? What's it trying to do?
The main goal is to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. This is seen as super important for avoiding the worst effects of climate change.
Sounds ambitious. How does it actually plan to do that?
Well, it works through these things called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs.
Yeah.
Basically, each country sets its own goals for cutting emissions, and the idea is that these pledges will be reviewed and made stronger over time.
So each country takes responsibility for its own actions.
Yeah, it's a bottom-up approach, but there's a big focus on being transparent and accountable. Countries have to report regularly on their progress, and there's a system for reviewing these efforts together.
Makes sense. But what about fairness? Developed countries have contributed the most to this problem. Does the Paris Agreement take that into account?
It does. It recognizes the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, meaning that developed countries should take the lead in helping developing countries transition to economies that don't rely so much on fossil fuels, by providing financial and technological support.
So it's not just about setting targets, it's also about making sure developing countries have what they need to meet those targets.
Right. And there's also a focus on adaptation, recognizing that climate change is already happening. We need to be able to deal with its impacts. This is especially important for vulnerable countries that are already feeling the effects of climate change.
Our sources say that the Paris Agreement has been praised for being ambitious and inclusive, but it's not perfect. What are some of the challenges it faces?
One big challenge is enforcement. The agreement relies a lot on countries doing what they say they'll do and peer pressure instead of strict penalties. Some people say this makes it hard to make sure countries actually keep their promises.
So there's a risk that some countries might not do what they agreed to or might even backtrack on their efforts.
Yeah, that's a worry. Another challenge is whether the pledges are even enough. Even if every country does exactly what it's promised, it's probably not going to be enough to meet those temperature goals.
So there's a gap between what countries are doing and what needs to be done to stop dangerous levels of warming.
Exactly. And closing that gap will require countries to be more ambitious, especially the ones that emit the most.
This really shows how complex international climate negotiations are. It's a balancing act between ambition, fairness, and what's politically possible.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for UPSC aspirants to go beyond just understanding the basics of the Paris Agreement. They need to analyze its strengths and weaknesses, the challenges of actually making it work, and the debates surrounding climate action.
Okay, so we've covered a lot today, from the science of climate change to its global effects and the international agreements. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to a question we asked before. If climate change really is a global problem that needs us all to work together, does it mean we need to rethink the very foundations of international relations?
That's a huge question, and it's one that's being debated right now. You know, the traditional system where each country focuses on its own power and interests often struggles to deal with global issues like climate change.
Right. Like we're trying to solve a 21st century problem with ideas from the 17th century.
Exactly. Some argue that we need a totally new way of cooperating internationally, one that recognizes how interconnected our world is and that we all share the same fate. This could mean strengthening global institutions, giving more power to non-state actors, and rethinking what it means for a country to be sovereign.
It's a tough challenge, but also a chance to create a better and more sustainable world.
For sure. And for all our future diplomats and policymakers out there, this is something you'll be dealing with directly.
So to all our listeners, especially those preparing for the UPSC exam, remember, climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It's a complex problem that connects with economics, politics, security, and even ethics.
It requires critical thinking, a nuanced understanding of different viewpoints, and the ability to apply abstract concepts to the real world.
And as we've learned today, it asks us to question our assumptions, challenge the way things are, and be creative in finding solutions.
If you want to explore these ideas further, check out the sources we use for this deep dive. They offer a lot of information and perspectives.
And remember, learning about climate change is a journey. Keep being curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.
We hope this deep dive has been helpful and interesting. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends and fellow UPSC aspirants. We'll be back soon with more deep dives into fascinating and important topics.